Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be talking about the connection or the relatedness between budget deficits and national debt. Now, a lot of people confuse budget deficit and national debt as the same thing, but they are different. And I'm sure by now you guys are already aware of that. But in general, I receive a lot of queries by the students asking me, they think that they both are the same thing. Well, they're not. But you should be aware of how they both are related and how they both are connected. And if let's say the budget deficit is going up or down, what will be the impact on national debt? Right? So if you and so in this video we're going to be talking about these two terms that you have already heard in my previous videos and under policies as well, in the context of you've heard these two terms in the context of government spending, budgets and borrowing, right? The terms deficit and debt, and like I mentioned, they are not the same. So a deficit basically is a situation where we spend more than we are taking in tax revenue. We as in the government here, right? So the government spends more in a year than they are taken in tax revenue in that year, and the difference, that is the amount that we are overspending that year, is going to be our deficit, also called. So this is the budget deficit. Now the budget deficit in economics is also known as the fiscal deficit, right? While debt, on the other hand, also called the national debt, and the national debt is also called the public debt, right? Is the total amount that you owe as a nation, that is the total amount owed. And now we are going to establish the relation between the two. So the national debt is basically, but before national debt, let's say if you were to ask me what is government borrowing, like why is the government borrowing? So the government borrowing in economics is known as the public sector borrowing, and economists are particularly interested in what and how much the government borrowing is, because that has implications on the wider economy. So public sector borrowing is the amount that the government must borrow each year to finance their spending, that is to finance their deficit spending. That is what the government borrowing is, right? So, and what is a national debt? National debt is the public sector debt, which is a measure of accumulated national debt which is owed by the government sector or the public sector. Now accumulated मैं इसलिए बोल रहा हूँ, and the reason why I'm saying accumulated is अभी वीडियो में भी आपको आगे पता चल जाएगा. But you see, the national debt is a total amount of money that a country owes to its creditors, and it's basically representing the sum of past deficits. So it's not just, the national debt in year 2 would comprise of the borrowing done in year 2 plus the debt you already have in year 1. And I'll also explain it to you through an example as well. So it's representing, the national debt is a total amount of money that a creditor owes, and it is representing the sum of your past deficits. क्योंकि जितने का deficit होगा उतनी government borrow करेगी, right? So so like I said, let's establish a relation between the two. So let's take an example now. Let's take an imaginary situation and let's think about the deficits each year, right? So you have like year 1, 2, 3, 5, year 1 to 5 over here, and then you have deficits and debt over here, right? So let's say, so each year ka deficit bhi hai, each year ka debt bhi hai, right? So let's say in year 1, let's take an example of a hypothetical country where in year 1 we overspend. Year 1 में we overspend कर दिया तो deficit आ गया. We're talking about budget deficits here. Budget deficit आ गया 200 billion लेते हैं billion dollars का, right? So you have a hypothetical country, $200 billion का deficit आ गया है. So let's write. So I've written 200 billion on deficits. Now if we assume that the debt was zero before year 1, if अगर हम assume करें कि debt हमारा zero है, so the country now owes 200 billion in year 1, and that is its debt, that is its national debt. तो national debt year 1 में 200 billion हो जाएगा, because obviously borrowing होगी 200 billion, deficit financing होगी तो borrowing होगी, that is national debt. और year 1 से पहले we are assuming there is no national debt, right? Now next year, let's say we run a deficit of 100 billion. अब next year 2 में basically हमारा 100 billion dollars का deficit हुआ है in year 2, right? And now for us to calculate the national debt, we would add 200 from the previous year as well, with 200 basically. So we would add 200 from last year to this 100 this year, because now we owe. So in year 2, at the end of year 2, how much do you owe? right? You owe $300 billion now. So by the end of year two, because now we owe the money that we owed before plus another $100 billion this year as well. So this year, by the end of this year, the total debt is $300 billion. This is your national debt by the end of year two. And in year three, if we run another deficit, let's assume that the deficit बहुत बड़ा है, because we spent a lot more this year than we took in tax revenue. So let's say 500 billion का deficit है. So अब debt जो होगा हमारे पास by the end of year three, that would be $800 billion. That is 500 that we borrowed this year plus 300 billion ka debt last year. So their debt by the end of year three stands at $800 billion, right? And also, you can pay down our debts as well. Debts will reduce in that case. And in order to pay down our debt, we would run a surplus in a year. That is a budget surplus. We can also view the budget surplus as a negative deficit. So let's say that, the economy runs a budget surplus of $100 billion. So we can write it as a negative deficit. $100 billion, negative $100 billion, basically. Right? So now people, अब ये जो $100 billion का negative deficit है, now people won't say that the government runs a negative $100 billion का deficit. Instead, they would say that the government ran a budget surplus. ये हमने लिखा इसको negative deficit है in numbers, but people would say that economists would say that this is representing a budget surplus, right? But let's say that they did run a surplus in that year, and what will happen is that they will pay down their debt because of this. So now the debt will reduce because of this budget surplus. So debt 800 था, अब debt कितना हो जाएगा? अब debt हो जाएगा 700. So budget surpluses will reduce the debt. So now the debt would be 700. So you can see that in year 4, you have a budget surplus of 100 billion, but still you have a national debt of 700 billion, right? And we can also have a year where we could have a balanced budget. Agar balanced budget hai, that is we don't have any deficit or surpluses, where we aren't running any surplus or deficit. So in that case, for example, in that case, if we run a balanced budget, neither a budget surplus or deficit, in that case, our debt would stay the same. So let's say you have a balanced budget. So this case में जिस year में हमारा balanced budget होगा, neither we have any budget deficit or surplus. So in that case, our debt would stay the same at $700 billion, right? Now, some people mistakenly believe that a balanced budget means that the government has no debt. No, it's not that. It only means that they have no new debt. Understood? So the debt would stay the same as $700 billion. And a budget surplus also means that you have no debt. ऐसा भी नहीं है कि budget surplus also means that you have, ऐसा भी नहीं है that a budget surplus does not means that you have no debt. No, you have debt at standard 700 billion. It just means that, if you have a budget surplus, the debt will decrease, right? Now, automatic stabilizers, guys, also has an impact, by the way, on national debt. We've already learned about automatic stabilizers and their role in stabilizing economic fluctuations and, economic output and incomes. So, for example, if the economy slows down, right, there's an economic contraction. So taxes, taxes. So हर दफ़ा हम ये नहीं बोलेंगे, by the way, just to इस वक्त मैं different बात कर रहा हूँ. हर दफ़ा ये नहीं बोलेंगे if the GDP falls, if the GDP rises, we are like A2 students, we are like technical learned students, right? So हमारा तरीका बोलने का ये नहीं होगा. हमारा तरीका होगा कि we're going to say, so for example, if the economy slows down, tax. तो अब चले, coming back to the point. So for example, if the economy slows down, taxes which are based on people's incomes are automatically going to decrease. Obviously, that's because people are earning less incomes, and when the economy is slowing down, right? And at the same time, government spending in the form of transfer payments is going to increase because more people will now qualify and become eligible for unemployment benefits when the economy slows down. And when the economy slows down, let's assume that we have a balanced budget previously. So when the economy slows down, a balanced budget will convert or become a budget deficit automatically because of the automatic stabilizer. And that's because of the automatic stabilizer we have. And hence, when we have a budget deficit now from a budget balanced budget, our national debt will increase, it will rise. And, when the economy booms, on the other hand, we have the opposite effect happening. Taxes are automatically going to increase because of a boom, and that's because people are earning more incomes, and therefore income tax revenues will increase. And at the same time, fewer people are going to qualify for transfer payments like unemployment benefits. Fewer people will be eligible now, and hence government payments for those transfer payments will decrease, and hence government spending will go down on those transfer payments. And if there is an economic boom, then a balanced budget will become a budget surplus because of the automatic stabilizer, and hence we know when a budget surplus hota hai, so now your national debt falls. So this is how your automatic stabilizers can potentially have an impact on your national debt. And as an A2 students, you must be knowing that ये काफ़ी दफ़ा MCQs के अंदर ये पूछ चुके हैं ये एक concept देके about how it can have an impact. So see, countries that accumulate so much national debt, so we as countries and we as economists, might be concerned. So yes, that is or could be concerning, but some economists also argue that, since the economy has grown, ठीक है, national debt बहुत ज़्यादा आ रहा है आपका, but economy भी तो अच्छी खासी grow करी है. So since the economy has grown and expanded, so we need to see that what really matters is that आप नेशनल डेट निकालें एज अ परसेंटेज ऑफ जीडीपी. नेशनल डेट को निकालें एज अ परसेंटेज ऑफ जीडीपी, विच इज़ बेसिकली योर डेट टू जीडीपी रेशो, राइट. अब ये देखें कि वो डेट को एब्सोल्यूट टर्म्स में देखने के बजाय आप ये देखें कि वो एज अ परसेंटेज ऑफ जीडीपी कितना है, राइट, विच इज़ सिंपली योर डेट टू जीडीपी रेशो. सो फॉर एग्जांपल लेट्स से कि हमारा नेशनल डेट जो है वो $20 million है, लेट्स से, एंड वी बी लाइक ओ माई गॉश दैट्स अ लॉट. ठीक है, fine on paper, yes, but if economists sort of say that okay fine, debt is $20 million, but GDP भी तो देखें कितनी है. So if your GDP is $200 million, so it means that your debt is only 10% of your GDP, right? So then this makes this figure less dramatic then, right? So national debt as a percentage of GDP is basically your debt to, which is your debt to GDP ratio, is a very important metric or a key metric used to assess the sustainability of a country's debt. क्योंकि ठीक है, डेट तो आपने लिया हुआ है, लेकिन जब आप अपनी कंट्री की जीडीपी मेजर करेंगे तो उससे आपको पता चलेगा कि आप डेट सस्टेन कितना कर सकते हैं, राइट, relative. So it's a very key metric used to assess the sustainability of a country's debt levels, relative to the size of the economy. So, and it provides us with very much key insights into whether the government will be able to service its debts, debt obligations, providing us with valuable insights into the government's ability basically to service its debt obligations relative to its overall economic output. मतलब अगर economic output से मैं compare करूँ, GDP से compare करूँ, तो क्या मतलब इतनी GDP generate हुई है कि हम debt service कर पाएंगे, right? So ये आपके पास फॉर्मूला है, नेशनल डेट अपॉन जीडीपी टाइम्स 100. सो डेट टू जीडीपी रेशियो एक बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट इंडिकेटर है ऑफ अ कंट्रीज फिस्कल हेल्थ. फिस्कल हेल्थ को अगर हम देखें तो इन दोज टर्म्स, इन दैट कॉन्टेक्स्ट, अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट इंडिकेटर विद रिस्पेक्ट टू योर फिस्कल हेल्थ एंड योर इकोनॉमिक स्टेबिलिटी एज वेल, राइट. अगर आपका डेट टू जीडीपी रेशियो बहुत हाई है, अ वेरी हाई डेट और हाई डेट टू जीडीपी रेशियो में इंडिकेट दैट अ कंट्री इज़ बोरोइंग एक्सेसिवली रिलेटिव टू इट्स इकोनॉमिक आउटपुट. मतलब कंट्री के इकोनॉमिक आउटपुट से कंपेयर्ड उसकी बोरोइंग जो है वो अच्छी खासी है, विच कुड लीड टू concerns about what? Concerns about the ability to repay its debt obligations in the future. But on the other hand, a low debt to GDP ratio will indicate that a country's debt burden is relatively small compared to the size of the economy or the GDP, which will simply indicate what? It will simply indicate a healthier fiscal position and a sustainability of your economy and the economy's debt as well. So policy makers एक important benchmark या metric के तौर पे इसको यूज़ करते हैं to look at the economic stability and the fiscal health of the country, right? Now, if we look at the pros and cons of running a deficit and then acquiring debt to finance the budget deficit, and if we acquire debt, national net हमारा बढ़ेगा to finance the deficit and to finance the overspending basically, So one argument in favor could be कि ठीक है, I mean fine, but that it allow, I mean it's allowing the government to do counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Counter-cyclical fiscal policy, for example, expansionary. Counter-cyclical is an expansionary fiscal policy example है. Even contractionary भी counter-cyclical है. But for example, let's say we are in a recession, so this debt, if you're in a recession, so this debt-financed fiscal policy or debt-financed fiscal stimulus would help come us out of recession. So one logical argument in favor of the debt is it will help come us out of recession because ये पैसे हम spend करेंगे, which will help generate incomes and output and close the output gap, so via the spending multiplier, which would make recessions less severe or maybe end it as well, allowing everyone to be better off in the long run, right? तो ये argument दिया जाता है. Now, while these things are definitely debated हैं ये चीज़ें, pros and cons, हम देख चुके हैं fiscal policy में इसके pros cons evaluations भी. So while these things you can debate them, but if you look at the downside of national debt, उसकी definitely downside भी है, वो भी as A2 student पता होनी चाहिए आपको. One could argue that at some point the debt could become unsustainable. ठीक है, लार्ज या स्मॉल हम बात नहीं करते, हम वी आर नॉट एन ओ लेवल और AS लेवल, हम सस्टेनेबल अनसस्टेनेबल के तौर पे बात करते हैं. ठीक है, लार्ज डेट्स बोलते हैं हम, लेकिन वी नीड टू इंक्लूड द वर्ड अनसस्टेनेबल. ठीक है जी. सो द डेट कुड बिकम अनसस्टेनेबल एंड वी हैव सीन इन द पास्ट कि कंट्रीज हैव बिन रनिंग लार्ज नेशनल डेट, और उनका नेशनल डेट्स इतने इंक्रीज हो चुके हैं कुछ कंट्रीज के that some of the countries have not been even able to service the interest on it. सही है. And at some point the interest on the debt could significantly balloon that government cannot even afford to pay it. And even if it can afford to pay it, then one argument is that against it is that the money used to pay the interest could otherwise have been used to pay other things. इतना बड़ा आप interest दे रहे हैं कि ये payment आप hospital, schools और infrastructure में लगा सकते थे. So also, I mean, large deficits when financed by borrowing, where government adds on to debt, leads to the crowding out effect. हम पढ़ चुके हैं ये, because जब government borrow करती है loanable funds market में, हम देख चुके हैं कि how does that works. इसके दोनों cases देख चुके हैं, which can actually drive up the interest rates. So to service debt, तो अगर interest rates बढ़ते हैं, then you know how the crowding out effect works. Now the thing is that अब आपको डेट को सर्विस करना है, इंटरेस्ट भी सर्विस करना है. सो टू सर्विस डेट, टैक्सेस कुड राइज इन फ्यूचर, स्पेशली दीज रिग्रेसिव टैक्सेस विच कैन वर्सन इनकम इनक्वालिटी. और कभी कभी गवर्नमेंट्स कुड ऑल्सो एंड अप कटिंग असेंशियल स्पेंडिंग कट्स कर सकती है ऑन असेंशियल पब्लिक एक्सपेंडिचर्स, which could actually again worsen income inequality. And income inequality is a key macroeconomic objective and an indicator of economic health of a nation and prosperity of a nation, in fact. So basically you see the countries is कि फिर वही होता है कि austerity measures पे अब आपने debt तो ले लिया. So basically to tackle large national debt, अब आपने national debt आपके पास अच्छा खासा आ गया है, सही है. To tackle the large national debt, countries में have to adopt, countries क्या करेंगे, they have to adopt austerity measures, which means increasing taxes and reducing spending. So for example, you can, इसमें आप Greece की example दे सकते हो. You can give the example of Greece here that austerity measures, तो आपको पता है ये वो policies होती हैं, government policies that are designed or aimed at cutting back spending and increasing tax collection basically in order to address the national debt issue. अब Greece में austerity measures लगी जा चुकी हैं past में. You can give that example of Greece in the past. और Greece में ये हुआ था कि value added taxes were increased. In fact, public sector की salaries were frozen, and जो public sector के assets थे, they were sold to raise revenue. ठीक है. So that's what all debt can do. In fact, debt का एक और बहुत significant problem आता है, वो ये आता है that it can decrease confidence. High level of national debt can erode investor confidence in the economy, and investors may panic and be concerned about government's ability to repay the debt, right? And this can create a lot of fears among the investors. In fact, high levels of debt can also pose the economy at a risk of default. So yeah, excessive national debt can increase the risk of default. Pakistan was on the brink of default in 2022, but IMF saved us. So excessive national debt can increase the risk of default. अब यहाँ पे आप सोच रहे होंगे कि IMF की मैंने बात क्यों की है. आपको ये समझना भी ज़रूरी है, मैं अभी बताऊंगा भी आगे, कि नेशनल डेट जो है ना, इट कंसिस्ट ऑफ डोमेस्टिक डेट एंड इंटरनेशनल डेट एज वेल. इट कंसिस्ट ऑफ जो आपने डोमेस्टिक बोरोइंग की हुई है बाय सेलिंग बॉन्ड्स टू इंडिविजुअल्स, बैंक्स एंड private sector firms and institutions, and also loans and borrowing that you have done internationally from international organizations like the IMF and from international governments as well, right? तो ये सब national debt का हिस्सा होता है. So और एएस इकोनॉमिक्स में आपको, अगर आपने याद हो, आपने पढ़ा होगा, इनफैक्ट अभी जो एएस की मैंने वीडियोस भी अपलोड की हैं आप लोगों के लिए, उसमें आप पढ़ेंगे, उसमें करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट को फाइनेंस करने के लिए, जो लास्ट ईयर एएस के बच्चे हैं जो भी सुन रहे हैं उनको पता होगी ये बात मैंने बताई थी कि जो करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट्स को फाइनेंस करने के लिए गवर्नमेंट बोरोइंग कैसे करती है, विच फ्यूल्स अप टू नेशनल डेट, एंड हाउ कैन दैट रिजल्ट इन लीड टू अ रिस्क ऑफ डिफॉल्ट. अब सो रिस्क ऑफ डिफॉल्ट जो है वो बहुत बढ़ जाता है. एक्सेसिव नेशनल डेट कैन इंक्रीज द रिस्क ऑफ डिफॉल्ट, एंड Pakistan was on the brink of a default in 2021 when we got money from the IMF. The tranche was released to us, and देखें default में problem ये होता है कि default is simply when the country cannot repay its debts. That's what default is. So default में countries lose a lot of credibility, and even they may even have problems in borrowing again in the future, or they may even have to offer higher interest rates to borrow in the future. And again, the problem is that they may have to then face austerity measures. They may face very strict, challenging austerity measures in order to address its underlying structural issues. अब इसकी एग्जांपल IMF है. IMF ने जो हमें लोन ट्रांच रिलीज़ की है, बहुत स्ट्रिक्ट कंडीशंस लगाई हैं कि आप टैक्सेस बढ़ाएंगे, यू विल कट ऑफ अननेसेसरी सब्सिडीज ऑन फ्यूल पे जो हम सब्सिडीज दे रहे थे. So the point what we are trying to say over here is that what happens is that then when you get these loans and when you have huge debts, then you have to undertake very strong challenging austerity measures, right? And that is why you see that taxes are being increased in Pakistan as well, because which is part of the austerity measures that the IMF has instructed us to do in order to collect in order to increase our tax revenues, क्योंकि हम debt लेके बैठे हुए हैं अपने सर पे, right? Okay, so these are very strong problems that are associated with debt, and these problems could actually worsen, especially for developing or poor nations. This could be a critical issue, right? Also now guys, before I end this video, there's one important thing that I want you guys to know, that a country's total debt, जिसको हम public debt बोल रहे हैं, तो country's public debt or national debt is your total amount that is borrowed by a government to finance its deficits, right, primarily. So now you need to understand that and ये जो debt हमने लिया हुआ है, so this debt जिसकी हम बात कर रहे हैं, that comprises of domestic debt, ठीक है, and your international debt. So the debt that we are talking about right now comprises of domestic debt and your international debt, and it could be in the form of bonds, treasury bills, and bonds. हमने इसको एक ही चीज़ consider की है, and हालांकि थोड़ा सा difference है, but for your sake, for the sake of your A2, we are saying bonds / treasury bills, or debt securities, debt instruments basically. So this comprises of bonds, treasury bills, and loans that have been borrowed, or borrowed funds from domestic lenders, or even international lenders like the IMF, or maybe international lenders like maybe different. It could be different governments or countries as well. For example, Pakistan ने borrowing की हुई है, not only from IMF but from China, from Saudi Arabia, right? So debt आपका domestic debt भी है, international debt भी है. Domestic debt is borrowing within the country's borders, from when you sell bonds to domestic individuals, to banks, domestic institutions, right? And external debt, जैसा कि मैंने आपको बताया, they comprises of loans that have been issued by institutions and countries to us, जिन्होंने foreign lending हमें की. So that's your international debt. अभी जो मैंने आपको बताया है, अच्छा, so basically तो ये तो आपको बात समझ में आ गई कि पब्लिक डेट कंप्राइजेज ऑफ बोथ डोमेस्टिक डेट एंड योर एक्सटर्नल डेट, और यू कैन से इंटरनेशनल डेट बेसिकली. सो बेसिकली बोरोइंग जो होती है, लाइक वी सेड कि इट इज़ बेसिकली टू फाइनेंस डेफिसिट्स, ठीक है. जैसे कभी हम पढ़ रहे हैं कि डेफिसिट फाइनेंसिंग की वजह के लिए जो होती है बोरोइंग होती है. अब दो तरह के डेफिसिट्स होते हैं. एक है बजट डेफिसिट, जो अभी आपने पढ़ा कि बजट डेफिसिट का क्या कनेक्शन है डेट से. एक और भी डेफिसिट होता है करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट, जो एएस में आप पढ़ के आ रहे हैं. तो बजट डेफिसिट को फाइनेंस करने के लिए जो बोरिंग होगी वो डोमेस्टिक डेट जनरेट करेगी, और जो करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट को फाइनेंस करने के लिए जो बोरोइंग होगी वो इंटरनेशनल यानी कि एक्सटर्नल डेट जनरेट करेगी. अब आप जाहिर सी बात है, जब बीओपी एक्सचेंज रेट का चैप्टर दोबारा पढ़ेंगे तो जो पुराने बच्चे हैं उनको तो ये बात समझ आ गई होगी. करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट को फाइनेंस करने के लिए जो बोरोइंग होती है वो लास्ट एएस में हमने अच्छे से किया था. जो नए स्टूडेंट्स हैं वो जब वो करंट अकाउंट वाली वीडियोस देखेंगे जो मैंने अपलोड की हुई हैं, उनको उस वक्त समझ में आ जाएगा. वहाँ मैंने एक्सप्लेन किया हुआ है कि करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट को फाइनेंस करने के लिए किस तरीके से बोरोइंग होती है. सो दैट इज गोइंग टू प्राइमरीली रिजल्ट इनटू एक्सटर्नल डेट और योर इंटरनेशनल डेट, एंड टुगेदर डोमेस्टिक डेट एंड इंटरनेशनल डेट इज नोन एज योर नेशनल डेट, और यू कैन से पब्लिक डेट. अब ये पब्लिक डेट ज़्यादा होगा तो जाहिर सी बात है इन्वेस्टर कॉन्फिडेंस शेक होगा, क्योंकि लेंडिंग जो लेंडर्स हैं हमारे, वो डोमेस्टिक इंस्टीट्यूशंस और डोमेस्टिक इंडिविजुअल्स खाली नहीं है. जैसे मैंने कहा कि टोटल डेट जो होता है वो दैट कंप्राइजेज ऑफ योर इंटरनेशनल डेट एज वेल, एक्सटर्नल डेट एज वेल. So it's also going to panic your international investors as well. ठीक है, बिकॉज दे विल ऑल्सो पैनिक कि भाई ये डिफॉल्ट तो नहीं कर जाएंगे हमारे डेट पे, विल दे बी एबल टू रीपे अस और नॉट, राइट. सो व्हाट यू ऑल्सो लर्नड इन दिस वीडियो वाज कि आपका डोमेस्टिक डेट होता है और एक्सटर्नल डेट होता है, एंड टुगेदर दे मेक अप योर टोटल पब्लिक डेट. While domestic debt refers to debt that is owed by the government to your domestic lenders and creditors, such as they could be individuals, financial institutions, and other entities within the country, right? And it includes when the government issues debt instruments like government bonds and treasury bills in the domestic market, basically to finance, budget deficits and other spending needs. So, and financing budget deficits through domestic borrowing adds up to your domestic debt, which obviously leads to national debt or increases national debt. While दूसरा जो debt है आपका external debt है, that is international debt, it refers to the debt that is owed by the government to foreign lenders and foreign organizations and institutions, and even foreign countries as well, and foreign financial investors, right? So, and together they make up the domestic debt and international and external debt make up your total public debt for a country, right? And total public debt, basically it's all the government liabilities or debt that it owes to your domestic or your international lenders. So that's it, guys. I hope you understood this video and enjoyed it as well. I'll see you all around in the next video. Until then, take care.